Back in 2009 or 2010, my life was a mess. I was young, reckless, and had no real direction. I had ended up in a small Alabama town, far from where I grew up, taken in by a man named Thomas and his family. Thomas and his wife, Rachel, were good people, at least on the surface. They had a hobby that fascinated me: paranormal investigations. Their group would seek out the supernatural, documenting encounters with things most people chose to ignore. Thomas had a stepson, Michael, who was around my age. We hit it off immediately, forming a bond that felt more like brothers than friends. Rachel had a paper route she managed on Fridays and Saturdays, and sometimes Michael and I would take over for her, earning a little cash while cruising through the eerie backroads of our little town. One particular Friday night, we decided to take the route. We left the house around 10:30 p.m., drove to pick up the newspapers, and started making deliveries. The route took us through the darkest, most isolated areas, a maze of backroads winding between Boaz and Albertville. The night was perfect, music blasting, laughter echoing through the car, the kind of fun only the young and reckless can have. Around 1:15 a.m., we reached a lonely gravel road leading to a cul-de-sac. It was one of the last stops of the night. As we pulled up to deliver the papers, the thick woods behind the houses stood ominously, silent and suffocating. Something about the air felt heavy, wrong, but we ignored it, going about our business. Then we heard it, a guttural shriek ripping through the silence. Michael froze, paper in hand, and turned to me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my pulse quickening. Before I could say anything, the sound came again, closer this time, like whatever made it had moved to the edge of the woods, only 100 yards away. Michael's face drained of color. "We're done. Let's get the hell out of here." He tossed the remaining papers into the back seat, slammed the car into drive, and sped off. We had barely hit 20 miles per hour when the sound came again, this time right behind us. My stomach twisted as I turned to look at Michael, only to realize he was staring at something outside my window, his expression one of pure horror. I followed his gaze. A shadow moved alongside the car, something darker than the night itself. It was massive, shaped like a large feline but with tattered, ragged edges, as if reality itself could barely hold it together. It had no visible legs, yet it kept pace with us effortlessly. The only illumination came from our headlights, yet I could see its silhouette clearly, like a void in the fabric of the world. My breath hitched as it moved closer, never once turning its head toward us. We reached a stop sign where the gravel road met the main street. Michael, against all logic, slowed down. The creature pulled ahead slightly before it did something that shattered any illusions of it being natural. It leaped forward, clearing the stop sign in one unnatural movement. As it did, its head finally turned toward us. One eye. A single, burning red-orange eye, like a dying ember in a pit of darkness. Michael slammed his foot on the gas as the thing shot off to the right, letting out one final, ear-splitting shriek before disappearing into the night. We sat in silence, adrenaline pumping, both of us barely able to process what we had just seen. Neither of us spoke a word as we finished the route in record time. Normally, we would get home between 6 o'clock and 7 a.m., but that night, we pulled into the driveway at 3 a.m. As soon as we stepped out of the car, we saw Thomas sitting on the porch, waiting for us. His expression was grave, like he had something important to say. But before he could get a word out, he saw our faces and hesitated. "What happened?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. We told him everything, every sound, every movement, every detail of the thing we had seen. Thomas's face darkened as he listened. When we finished, he exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "What time did this happen? Where exactly?" We answered, and he nodded grimly. After a long pause, he finally spoke words that made my blood run cold. "I hate to tell you this, but earlier tonight, around 1 a.m., someone I used to know, Daniel, hung himself on his ex-girlfriend Sarah's porch." The name meant nothing to me, but Michael's expression changed. Daniel and Sarah had once been part of Thomas's paranormal group, but they had dabbled in things far darker than ghosts. They had delved into demonology, summoning entities they could not control. Their obsession had consumed them, and their relationship had crumbled under the weight of their choices. Sarah had managed to walk away, but Daniel? He had never stopped playing with fire. According to Sarah, Daniel had shown up at her house that night, desperate, rambling, as if something unseen were controlling him. She had tried to get him to leave, even called the cops, but at some point between her making that call and the police arriving, Daniel had gone silent. When she finally opened the door to check, she found him hanging from the porch beam, his belt around his neck. Her house sat just 2 miles down the road from where we had encountered the creature. If we had turned right instead of left, we would have driven straight past it. Thomas exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I think Daniel never really stopped messing with the dark stuff. And whatever he owed, something came to collect. Neither Michael nor I slept that night. Some things are better left alone. And some debts are paid in ways far worse than death. The days that followed were a blur. Michael and I barely spoke of that night, as if saying the words aloud would bring that thing back. But the image of its burning eye, the way it moved without sound, how it vanished into the dark, I could not shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. Thomas, however, seemed more troubled than either of us. He spent most of the following day making phone calls, speaking in hushed tones with people I did not know. When I finally asked him what he was doing, he hesitated before answering. "There are people who need to know," he said. "People who've dealt with things like this before." He would not elaborate, and I did not push. I had my own nightmares to deal with. A week passed before things got stranger. Michael and I had been avoiding the paper route since that night, but Rachel could not afford to keep skipping deliveries. Eventually, she asked us to go again, and despite our fear, we agreed. But this time, we were prepared. We brought flashlights, weapons, anything that might make us feel safer. We did not speak as we drove, just played music low and kept our eyes on the road. Everything was normal, almost boring, until we reached the same area. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. The darkness pressed in, thicker than before, suffocating in its silence. I gripped the wheel, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Then the car stalled. Come on, I muttered, turning the key. The engine sputtered but would not start. Michael's breath was shaky. "This is not happening." I refused to look outside. I refused to see if it was there again. The shriek came. Louder. Closer. I hit the key again. The car roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the road as fast as I could. I did not care if I wrecked. I just needed to get away. Michael was shaking, staring out the back window. It is not following us. I did not slow down. I did not care. When we got home, Thomas was waiting again. But this time, he was not alone. 2 older men sat on the porch with him, both dressed in dark clothes, their faces unreadable. One of them stood as we got out. "You saw it again." It was not a question. I nodded. The man exchanged a look with Thomas. Then he said something that sent chills through my body. "It knows you now." We went inside, and the men asked us to explain everything, every detail we could remember. When we finished, the other man, who had not spoken yet, finally leaned forward. This was not just some random encounter. That thing, whatever it is tied to Daniel. And now, it has noticed you. I swallowed hard. What does that mean? Thomas answered instead. It means you need to be careful. The conversation lasted hours. They told us things I could barely comprehend, about spirits that collect debts, about creatures that latch on to tragedy and grief. Whatever Daniel had summoned in his past had not been satisfied with just his life. It was still out there, hunting, looking for something, or someone, else. The men gave us things to protect ourselves. Symbols to place around the house. Instructions on how to keep it away. But they could not promise it would be enough. Michael and I never did the paper route again. Years passed. Life moved on. Michael and I drifted apart. But every so often, I would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, feeling like something was watching me from the darkness. And sometimes, just before I fell back asleep, I swore I could hear it. That shriek. Waiting. Life did not return to normal after that night. Even though Michael and I refused to do the paper route again, that feeling of being watched never faded. I could feel it in the corners of my vision, in the empty spaces between the streetlights when I walked alone. It had left its mark on me. Thomas became more secretive. He spoke in cryptic phrases, warning me not to talk about what happened to anyone outside of the house. I did not ask questions. I did not want the answers. Then the knocking started. It began one night, just after midnight. A single knock at the front door, soft but deliberate. I was awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I did not move at first, thinking it had to be my imagination. But then it came again. A third time. Rhythmic. Almost expectant. I stayed frozen in bed. Every instinct told me not to answer. Not to even look. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. I barely slept, and in the morning, I told Thomas. He went pale, his fingers gripping his coffee cup too tightly. "Do not open the door," he said. "Not unless you are absolutely sure who is on the other side." "Who would be knocking in the middle of the night?" I asked. Thomas hesitated. "Not someone." He took a breath. "Something." I thought about that all day. About what he meant. About that thing on the road. Was it trying to get in? Had I somehow brought it here? The knocking came again the next night. Louder this time. More insistent. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would give me away. The house was dead silent otherwise. No one else seemed to hear it. It continued for what felt like hours before stopping just as suddenly as before. I could not take it anymore. The next day, I packed a bag and told Thomas the first was leaving. I needed to get away, put distance between myself and whatever was happening here. He did not try to stop me. He just gave me a long, unreadable look and said, "It will follow." I left anyway. For a while, things seemed better. I moved 2 towns over, stayed with an old friend. I did not hear the knocking. I did not see shadows moving where they should not be. I thought maybe, just maybe, it had let me go. Then I got a phone call from Michael. His voice was shaky. "It is still here." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" "The knocking. It started after you left. But it is worse now." I did not know what to say. I thought I had escaped it. But it had just moved on, to him. "I think it is getting inside," Michael whispered. "I see things that are not there. I hear my name when no one is home." The line went dead before I could answer. I drove back that night. When I arrived at Michael's house, the lights were all off. The front door was slightly ajar. My stomach clenched. I stepped inside, calling his name. No answer. And then I heard it. The shriek. Right behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Heavy. Smothering. Then, from down the hall, I heard Michael's voice. Low. Unnatural. Chanting words I did not understand. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. Michael? Silence. Then, the whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You should not have come back. And then the lights went out. The darkness swallowed the house whole, pressing in around me like a living thing. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I fumbled for my phone, for a light, for anything to cut through the suffocating blackness. Then I heard it again. The whisper. Twisting, slithering through the air. You should not have come back. I turned toward the sound, my pulse thundering in my ears. A shape loomed at the end of the hallway. A shadow darker than the night itself. It moved forward, slow, deliberate, as if savoring my fear. The red-orange eye flickered open, burning, watching me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on something unseen. I crashed to the floor, pain shooting up my arm, but I barely felt it. The shadow thing loomed closer, stretching, shifting, whispering my name. Then, a sudden, piercing scream erupted from down the hall. Michael. Ignoring every instinct screaming at me to run, I forced myself up and bolted toward his room. The door stood open, swaying slightly as if it had just been pushed. Inside, I found him standing in the center of the room, his back to me, arms stiff at his sides. The air was thick, almost humming with an unnatural energy. Michael? My voice barely rose above a whisper. He turned slowly, unnaturally. His eyes, empty, black voids, locked onto mine. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out was not his. It is too late. The temperature dropped, my breath turning to mist. The shadows in the room stretched, reaching for me. I felt something, cold, heavy, grip my shoulder. The world tilted, my vision blurred. Then, light. Blinding, pure light burst through the room. Michael screamed, or maybe it was the thing inside him. I collapsed, gasping, as the weight lifted. Thomas stood in the doorway, holding something, a small, glowing talisman, his face grim and set with determination. Michael fell to the ground, unconscious. The shadows recoiled, hissing, retreating into the walls, into the floor. And then, just like that, the house fell silent. I did not ask Thomas what he had done. I did not want to know. I just helped him get Michael up, out of the house, into the waiting car. We never went back. Michael recovered, though he never spoke of that night again. He moved away, started over somewhere far from here. I did the same. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the knocking. Faint. Distant. A reminder. It knows I am still here. And it is waiting.